Traveling back and forth for work is exhausting. I live in a quiet town about an hour and a half from the city where I work. Normally, I just tough out the commute, but the weather that night was unforgiving. Sheets of rain, howling wind, and flash flood warnings made the drive home impossible. Instead of risking it, I decided to find a place to stay in the city. Hotels were either fully booked or ridiculously expensive, so I turned to Airbnb. Scrolling through the options, I found one last-minute listing. A small house. Nothing fancy, but close enough to my office that I wouldn't be late in the morning. The pictures looked fine, clean, cozy, and cheap. The neighborhood wasn't great, but at midnight, I wasn't in the mood to be picky. I booked it, grabbed my overnight bag from the car, and headed there. The place was on a dimly lit street with boarded-up windows and graffiti-covered walls. My stomach tightened as I parked and double-checked the address. This couldn't be right. But it was. The house itself looked slightly better than its surroundings. It had a fresh coat of paint, at least, and a working porch light. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The interior was unsettling. The furnishings were sparse and the layout was strange, like someone had hastily thrown the place together. There were no personal touches, no pictures, no knickknacks, nothing that made it feel like anyone had ever actually lived there. But it was dry and I was tired. I set my bag down, double-checked the locks, and got ready for bed. It started small. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I heard a faint creak, like someone stepping on a floorboard. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, and strained to listen. Nothing. Shaking it off, I convinced myself it was just the house settling. These old places always make noise. I turned off the bathroom light and headed to the bedroom. That's when I noticed the closet door. It was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I walked over, yanked it open, and shone my phone flashlight inside. Empty. Still, I jammed a chair under the doorknob, just in case. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket tightly around me. The storm outside raged on, wind rattling the windows and rain pounding the roof. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Clear, deliberate footsteps, coming from the hallway just outside the bedroom. My heart started racing. I reached for my phone, but my hand was trembling so badly I could barely grip it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. Peeking into the hallway, I saw nothing but shadows. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something odd. The front door, which I had locked, was slightly open. My gut told me to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped into the hallway, inching toward the door to close it. That's when I saw it. A figure was standing just outside the window, staring in at me. A man about 6 feet tall with pale, soaking wet skin, and his face, goodness, his face was twisted into an expression I can only describe as pure malice. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the lamp. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard the closet door in the bedroom slam open behind me. I spun around, but I couldn't see anything. The hallway was too dark. Adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted for the front door, barefoot and still in my pajamas. As I reached the porch, I heard heavy footsteps pounding after me, accompanied by a guttural, inhuman sound that I can still hear in my nightmares. I didn't stop running until I was in the middle of the street, drenched and gasping for air. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. My hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator stayed on the line with me as I waited for the police. I stood there in the freezing rain. I ducked out of view near a truck parked down the street from the house. I clutching my phone like a lifeline, too afraid to even look at the house. When the cops arrived, they searched the property, but didn't find anyone. Wet and muddy footprints can be found throughout the house and on the porch. I asked the officers to accompany me as I gathered my things. There was no way I was going back in that house alone. I later found out that a few homeless people from the neighborhood often used the home for overnight shelter since the residence was normally empty. The next day I called out from work and just drove home. I haven't stayed in an Airbnb or driven through that neighborhood since. When my wife, Emma, and I planned our first wedding anniversary, we wanted it to be special, something different from the usual dinner date. So we rented a cozy, secluded Airbnb cabin in a snowy mountain town about 3 hours from home. The pictures online were stunning. A roaring fireplace, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the forest, and fresh snow blanketing everything in sight. It seemed perfect. And at first we arrived in the early evening, just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. The cabin was exactly as advertised, warm, inviting, and peaceful. We spent our first night there sipping wine by the fire, reminiscing about our first year together. It was the perfect escape. The next day, the snow let up and we explored the property. We built a snowman, took photos, and made snow angels like kids. Later, we cooked dinner together and sat by the big windows watching the snow fall again as night crept in. But things took a turn later that evening. It was around 10 p.m. when I suggested we take a quick walk around the yard before bed. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, so it was fresh and undisturbed, or at least that's what I thought. We stepped outside, the cold biting but exhilarating. As we crunched through the snow near the side of the cabin, Emma stopped abruptly. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice low. At first, I didn't know what she was talking about. Then I saw them, footprints. They weren't ours. They were much bigger and deeper, as if someone heavier had been walking around the cabin. The tracks started near the woods, circled the cabin, and disappeared behind it. I felt a chill, and it wasn't from the weather. "Could it be a hiker?" I offered, trying to sound calm. "In this storm, at this time of night?" Emma's voice cracked slightly. We followed the tracks around the back of the cabin, but they just stopped. No return trail, no continuation, just an abrupt end near the back porch. Suddenly, the cabin didn't feel so cozy anymore. We decided to head into town to clear our heads and figure out what to do. From the warmth of our car, we called the local police, who agreed to meet us back at the property. When they arrived, they did a thorough check of the premises and surrounding area. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no disturbances, and no other tracks except the ones we saw. The officers assured us it was probably nothing, maybe an animal or an old set of tracks we didn't notice earlier. Reluctantly, we returned to the cabin, trying to convince ourselves they were right. But neither of us could relax. As we got ready for bed, every creak of the cabin felt louder. Every gust of wind seemed sinister. Emma double-checked every lock while I peered out the windows, scanning the yard for movement. Then we heard it, a soft crunching sound like someone walking through snow. Emma froze. I motioned for her to stay quiet and grabbed my phone. The crunching grew louder, moving around the side of the cabin. Then came the first bang, a heavy thud against the back door. Emma whispered, "Call the police." I was already dialing, my fingers trembling. Another bang, louder this time, rattled the glass. Emma clung to me as I explained to the dispatcher what was happening. She told us to stay inside and stay quiet while officers were dispatched. The banging stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then faintly we heard something scraping. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood near the door, ready for anything. But when the police arrived minutes later, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone near the cabin. "You're probably just spooked," one officer said kindly. "It's easy to imagine things out here, especially in a storm." They stayed for a while, patrolling the area before leaving. Emma and I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made my heart race. Every shadow felt like a threat. At first light, we decided we'd had enough. We packed up as quickly as we could, desperate to leave. As I loaded the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the back of the cabin, where the police had found no evidence the night before, there was something embedded in the snow. A pair of footprints, fresh and unmistakable, leading away from the cabin and vanishing into the woods. I didn't say a word to Emma. I just got in the car, started the engine, and drove us out of there as fast as I could. We haven't spoken about it since, but every time I think back to that night, one thought haunts me. Whoever or whatever was out there never left. They just waited. After graduating college, I decided to reward myself with a solo cross-country road trip. No set itinerary, just me, my car, and an endless playlist of true crime podcasts to keep me entertained. It was supposed to be a mix of self-discovery and adventure, a break before starting the grind of post-grad life. I kept costs low by staying at budget Airbnbs, usually found last minute at rest stops or gas stations. Most of them were decent enough, nothing fancy, just places to crash for the night. One evening, I found myself driving through the middle of nowhere in a rural state. Fields stretched endlessly on either side of the highway, and the sun was setting fast. My true crime podcast droned in the background, detailing yet another grisly case of a hitchhiker meeting the wrong stranger. I turned the volume down slightly. At a rest stop, I pulled out my phone to search for nearby Airbnbs. The app loaded slowly, but one listing caught my eye. Cozy country cottage, quiet and quaint. It was dirt cheap, had a few vague reviews that seemed positive, and was only 10 minutes off the highway. Perfect. I booked it, plugged the address into my GPS, and hit the road again. About 20 minutes later, my gas light came on, and I pulled into a small-town gas station. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with peeling paint and flickering neon lights. As I filled up, a woman in her 50s walked out of the convenience store, carrying a pack of cigarettes. She glanced at my out-of-state plates and smiled politely. Passing through, she asked, her southern drawl thick but friendly. Yeah, I said, headed to an Airbnb just down the road. She tilted her head. Which one? I told her the name of the listing, and her smile instantly vanished. You're joking, right? Her tone was sharp now, almost accusatory. I blinked, confused. She stepped closer, her voice low. Honey, do yourself a favor and cancel that booking right now. You don't want to stay there. My stomach nodded. Why not? She glanced around as if making sure no one else could hear us. Then she pulled out her phone and started tapping the screen. Here, she said, holding it out to me. The screen displayed a news article. The headline read, Unsolved Murders Plague Abandoned Farmhouse Turned Airbnb. My blood ran cold. According to the article, the property had a dark history. Over the last decade, multiple guests had gone missing after staying there. Some bodies were found buried on the property. Others were never recovered. The owner claimed ignorance, but the evidence was murky. The property had been shut down for a time, but reopened under a new host. I had no idea, I stammered, my voice trailing off. You wouldn't, she said grimly. They keep changing the name of the listing, and they don't tell you about the murders when you book. My heart pounded as I thought about how easily I could have walked into that nightmare. I immediately opened the Airbnb app, canceled the booking, and thanked her profusely. Where should I go instead? I asked, still shaken. She pointed down the road. There's a big chain hotel about 10 miles from here, clean, safe, and no murder history. I nodded, got back in my car, and drove straight to the hotel without looking back. That night, as I lay in the sterile comfort of a chain hotel room, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't stopped for gas or mentioned the Airbnb to that woman. I've always loved true crime stories, but in that moment, I realized how easily I could have become one. I didn't book another Airbnb for the rest of the trip.